Hi, everyone. My name is Pooja Mistry, and I am going to be talking to you all about designing APIs that stand the test of time. Thank you so much for having me at the TestFlix conference. I'm happy to be here. I wanted to let everyone know that my background is in DevRel, and I'm really lucky to have worked with a company called Postman, which is a API platform that is used by over 25 million people worldwide. And so for many teams, Postman is an everyday tool, and it's something that people use not only to test their APIs, but also to create their APIs. And in today's talk, we're talking about the process of designing and creating APIs. So we're going to talk about two different things. And when it comes to designing APIs, there's a couple of factors and questions I like to think is called, am I creating the right API, or am I creating the API right? So these two questions really dictate the kind of experience that you're going to have with your API, whether or not that experience is a good experience or a bad experience. So when we think about the good API experience, we're talking about usability, reusability, time to value, having APIs that evolve smoothly. And then, of course, when it comes to the bad API experience, we're talking about decreased productivity. And then this is for any type of API, whether that be a partner, public, or private. So when I think about API design, there are three focuses that I like to dive into. So the focuses that I like to dive into are purpose, usability, and evolution. And so purpose is really interesting because it basically, an API needs a purpose that makes sense for people, and it basically needs to be able to help them solve their problems. And it's not just something that plugs into a system. So in this scenario, one aspect that I like to think about is an example that is very near and dear to my heart. And so when I decided to design an API that had purpose, I thought about something that was something that I enjoyed, which was coffee. So when it came down to designing this API, I wanted to build an API that has purpose with the user. And so when it comes to that, I thought about what a user would like to select when it comes to creating or receiving a coffee. So perhaps they want to choose their bean type, perhaps they want to choose their milk type or their roast type. So thinking about all of the things that go with creating an API and how a user will use that API is so deeply involved with purpose. So these are the different aspects that make sense to the people. And this is how we create an API that's going to last the test of time. So this is a great quote by one of my colleagues and mentors, Arnaud. An API is first and foremost the interface for the people. So keeping this in mind is going to help you defining your purpose and defining an API that will last the test of time. So there are a couple of blogs I'd love to share. So the first blog that I'd love to share is a blog about designing for humans and building a better practice. And I kind of go into this blog describing the coffee API example. And so if you're interested, here are a couple of use cases on how a user would use this API to get what they ultimately want, is a brewed coffee. And so this kind of creating this example helped us build our different endpoints. So an endpoint to search a bean type, and then finally an endpoint that we wanted, once we got our bean type, to brew the coffee, which was our post request that we created. So I'm happy to share this blog for those who are interested in taking a deeper look. But let's dive a little bit into something that everyone is aware of, which is usability. And so usability is the experience of the user, and it is everything when it comes to working with an API. And so the best user experience is often the byproduct of one major thing, which is consistency. So we've all seen this triangle button in so many different applications in our lives. We've seen it on record players and in our video players. We've seen it in remotes, and of course we see it as a part of the YouTube symbol. And when we see this triangle, we know exactly what it means and what it does, and it means to play. And similarly, I like to think about consistency in the same way. So you want to build an API that's so consistent that it's almost predictable. So this makes interacting with your API effortless. And so users know exactly what to expect when it comes to working with your API, and they're a lot less likely to struggle using it. So I have an interesting blog that is called The 5 Dimensions of API Consistency. This was written by my colleague, and there are a lot of dimensions that, you know, you can be consistent. You can be consistent within the API. You can be consistent across the organization with the domain practices. You can be consistent with world practices, and also being consistent with standards. And so these are some things to keep in mind when you're designing your API: is how consistent can I make my API so that it is almost predictable. And so one place where consistency really plays a big deal is in naming. So naming is often overlooked, and it is something that you know, people think about, like, oh, I'll just name this API something obvious. But oftentimes naming is where we falter in consistency. So in this case, I have 2 endpoints. I'm planning to use the plural of it. So for example, if I'm going to get beans, I want to be consistent, and I want to use get beans with ID, not get bean and ID, and mix up that consistency. So there's a lot of places where you might need to think about, how am I going to be consistent? Do I want to use the plural naming? Do I want to use the singular naming? Do I want to use a query parameter? Do I want to use you know, something else? And so this is an interesting place for consistency to exist. So another place where usability is highly important is designing an API that has the most straightforward interaction. So when I look at this cockpit and there's so many buttons, I'm almost overwhelmed on where to start. And similarly, when it comes to working with APIs, we often require the user to require too much information before they even make the first API call. And so building an API that requires some of the most minimal and straightforward inputs, and it avoids using thousands of parameters, is going to be the most interesting when it comes to building an API that's going to be hit and in the first call. So you're going to increase your time to first call, and then this is going to ensure that your users are using this API without requiring a lot of information for them. So you want to keep thinking, like, how fast can I get my user to get to a status 200? If I require my user to require too much information, like it require too many strings and what they're asking for, like milk type and this type, like then they're not going to be able to utilize my API successfully. So this is very important when it comes to API design. And then finally, when it comes to usability, is error handling. And error handling is so important. How often have we stumbled upon this page, but we hit this 400 error and we have no idea what to do? This is such a funny response. If the problem continues, contact the site owner. I mean, who's the site owner? How does the user even know who that is? So oftentimes, this is a very tricky situation that we find ourselves into that makes our API not usable at all. So if I'm going to hit my 400 error and I'm not going to know what to do, I'm probably going to give up on that API. And so where we can make this a little bit more usable is adding a lot of information to our request. So a lot of times we require a lot of information from the user to get hit the API endpoint, but we don't send them enough information back that shows them how they've success, if they have worked with that API successfully, or if they're not. So in this case, working with my coffee API, I'm not sure if you can tell what the error here is, but I want the user to require a bean type, and they sent in Ben. And so here, not only have I sent them the 400 bad requests, but I've also told them what is required. So bean is required. And then I've also told them that we don't need Ben to brew a coffee. So this is how you can fix the error. And then I've also given them some positive reinforcement information, where, you know, if we don't have that particular milk type, here are the milk types that we have. We have the whole milk, almond milk, oat milk. So I'm telling them exactly what kind of information that is available that they can request. And so this allows the user to work with the API a little bit more dynamically and be able to get back to that 200 requests that they are looking for. And so, you know, this goes hand in hand with building a intuitive UI. And so not only have we told them what the errors are, but we've also given them positive reinforcement where they're requesting a light roast, and we're telling them, you're all good, we have that, and you just need to fix a couple of different things. So these are the couple of things when it comes to usability. So naming, being consistent with naming, requiring just enough information or the most minimal viable information that allows a user to hit their status 200, and then being a little bit more intuitive with your error messages, which will ensure that you'll get an API that is usable. And so this kind of takes me to my third point, which is evolution. So all APIs that are meant to stand the test of time are ones that are going to continuously scale and continuously evolve. And so when it comes to evolution, it also means dealing with breaking changes. So one place that we can find breaking changes is when we are in the data modeling of our API schema. So for example, if your response is a string and you change that to an object, you want to make your API extensible enough so that even if you do change your data, you're not introducing any breaking changes as you add new features and as you scale them and build your API in a more successful way. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to evolution is keeping up with documentation. So documentation is so important to the usability and the evolution of an API. And creating different versions of that API once new features are created, publishing new versions so that users know what was in the last version, what is new in this version, and updating the documentation to show the evolution of the API is so important to successfully create an API that stands the test of time. And so with that, I wanted to share one last blog with you, which is what is API first design? And this is also a blog by my colleague Arnaud. And he goes into talking about the 8 traits of effective API first design. So with API first design, it's API development model that basically uses an API design approach rather than a code first approach. And so it's an organizational strategy to basically deliver maximum value to the businesses. And so this is all about improving the quality of an API's infrastructure. And there are 8 traits to think about when it comes to some of these API first aspects. So alignment with a organization's goal, how reusable that API is, how interoperable that API is, how quickly or if it is able to evolve, its user friendliness, its security, efficiency, and pragmatism. And so these traits are really interesting when we think about designing APIs that are available to the users for a really long time. So be sure to take a look at this blog. I'm happy to link and share some of these blogs that I've shared in my talk today, but I hope this kind of gives you a little bit of a deeper insight when it comes to designing APIs that stand the test of time. We talked about purpose, we talked about usability, and then we talked about evolution. So those are the 3 aspects to keep in mind when you are going forward in designing your APIs. So with that, If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram or on LinkedIn, and I look forward to speaking here at this conference and connecting with you. Thank you.